Yes.
Good afternoon. I'm Rob Satloff, the director of the Washington Institute, and it's a great pleasure to welcome all of you today to this release and discussion about the Washington Institute's final paper in our Transition 2017 series, a paper titled Defeating Ideologically Inspired Violent Extremism, a product of the Institute's bipartisan study group on countering and preventing violent extremism. Just a word about this series. I know transition is a term, we should have already buried it since the administration is now 2.5 months old, but there's still a lot going on in transition. There's still a lot of change, still a lot of deliberation about the major elements of policy direction, and we actually think this is very well timed. The Transition 2017 series has produced a handful of discrete, policy-oriented analyses, and most importantly, recommendations on everything from Arab-Israeli politics to the crisis in Syria to policy in North Africa. This, our final in this series, takes a look at what is perhaps one of the most contentious issues in the policy debate of the new administration. And to do that, first I was delighted that our Stein, the director of our Stein Program on Intelligence and Counterterrorism, Dr. Matthew Levitt, took the lead to organize an outstanding bipartisan group of experts, people with experience from administrations past, people who are bound to have roles in administration's future, people who know this issue from the ground up and the top down. And I know that those are buzzwords, but in this case, they mean it. To take a look at this hotly contested topic. And I am convinced that this study, this is the executive summary of the study, the full 32-page study you can find on the Washington Institute's website. This study will have a major impact in the White House, in Capitol Hill, in the administration, and it will last. It will last well beyond the life of most transition papers because it actually has ideas and sound recommendations. I'm really delighted that that Matt, Samantha, and Rand will make some remarks and presentation, and that other members of our study group, Eric, Adnan, and Kate, will be here to participate in our discussion with you about this. There's more brain power on this topic, on this panel, than you'll find in any room in Washington. And so I'm really delighted now to turn the platform over to my colleague, Matt Levitt.
Thanks, Rob. Thank you all for coming. I want to lead by example and silence my cell phone. There you go. You could all follow suit. First of all, I just want to start off, a project like this, the research of which took over a year, is only made possible by the research assistants and the interns that make everything happen. And so Maxine Rich, raise your hand, come on. Maxine Rich is right here. Maxine was a research assistant who did all the scheduling. There's a lot of complicated schedules with this many members of a study group, and all of the briefings that we got from people in government, people who are working in communities, state, local, federal levels, and then now that we are doing the rollout, already meeting people in the interagency and briefing around town. Maxine did a huge job. Cole, our intern, did a great job, and I really want to thank them very, very much. I also want to thank the Washington Institute senior fellows who participated in this. Kate is on the panel. Aaron Selman was unable to be with us today, but played a very important role. And Jacob Oladort was also a very important player in this. Will not be able to participate in the panel because he is now working at DOD, and in that new capacity, maybe should be off the panel. But his contributions before he went into government service were huge, and we're grateful for those. We put together a real remarkable panel and worked hard on a bipartisan study on a very sensitive issue. And so this took some time, the drafting and redrafting, and I think what you have is the summary and what's available online and the small number available in hard copy is the full report, is something that I think has some very tangible recommendations and came out at a time when the new administration, like all administrations, is doing its policy review on a variety of things, and in particular on this issue. The administration's policy review on countering violent extremism, to call it that, to call it something else, to keep the CVE task force, to reshape it, how to structure it, what to do, what the federal government's role in all of this should be. These are all very hot issues right now, and I'm really humbled by the ability of the past few months to be able to work with people like those you're seeing here today. So I'm going to ask Rand to offer some comments. Samantha will follow. I'll close up with a few comments of my own, and then we'll open it up to Q&A, and we will include everybody in the panel on that. We just thought we'd save you from having this many presenters in the opening remarks. And again, thank you so much for coming. Rand, podium is yours.
Thank you, Matt, and Rob, also, and the Washington Institute for sponsoring this study effort on what I agree is a extraordinarily important and timely topic to think about. I want to focus primarily in my remarks on why we need to think hard about this, and I'm going to surprise you with my opening remark, which is, while I didn't know it, I started thinking about this issue 50 years ago when I was a platoon commander and a company commander and a regimental psychological warfare officer in Vietnam. And the lesson learned from that was, as we thought about conflict, then we realized that it was not just about holding territory, it was also about how do you hold the people in support of the effort to end the conflict. And so, as I came away from that, the notion that indiscriminate violence or other forms of coercive action or behavior, which focused entirely on a class of people as opposed to the enemy, only helped to either create or confirm more opposition to the effort in that remark. Now, I know that's a different context, it's a different kind of conflict, but it certainly, when I came back to government in 2009 at DHS and discovered that the previous administration had been thinking hard about how to deal with this issue domestically, that those kinds of thoughts came back to me. It was, to some extent, in the words of the great philosopher Yogi Berra, deja vu all over again. And so I became very much involved in the effort at DHS to think about that. And as we began in the Obama administration to carry on the work that had begun in the Bush administration, one of the things that really reinforced thinking about this was a study that was done by the FBI several years ago, in which they looked at all of the cases of terrorist acts in the United States that had been carried out, not that had been captured before that. And what they discovered was that in each and every one of those cases, there was some behavior that occurred before the incident actually, the violent incident actually took place, that fit a broad pattern of activities that were really precursors to mobilization to violence. And they then looked at whether or not that behavior was observable, and discovered that not only was it observable, but they identified 4 groups who either singly or together observe that behavior. Obviously, peers, family members, also some institutional figures like teachers or imams or educators. And the fourth group, the least significant group, were just other people observed that behavior. And that was actually less important. But the question then arose, so if these people observed this behavior, why wasn't it reported to authorities? And I think there are three general answers. One, the individuals who observed the behavior didn't appreciate what that behavior in fact foreshadowed. In some cases, they were simply in denial. They didn't want to recognize it as that kind of a precursor. And the third reason was because if they thought that it was meaningful, they understood that the only authority to which to report it was law enforcement, and they were reluctant for whatever reasons to report this kind of behavior to law enforcement authorities. And so as we move forward in thinking about this, the issue was what or how could we think about protecting society and preventing violence from actually occurring. And the answer that this group moved forward to was we need to think about off-ramps other than law enforcement, which is not to exclude law enforcement from the solution, but to think of off-ramps other than law enforcement in order to give people a way that they could bring this behavior to the attention of people who might be able to do something about it in the mental health communities, in the social work communities, in public outreach to inform people about that, and in educational communities, so that people understood what the behavior patterns looked like, and people understood where they could go that didn't necessarily call for a law enforcement solution. Law enforcement, as you see in the report, is working on over 900 cases now, and some of this behavior may be absolutely meaningless with respect to mobilization to violence, but the opportunity to find ways in order to redirect people away from violent actions, I think is an activity that society has to take. The second point is that this can't be a federal program alone. This happens in people's communities with the whole of community, as we suggest in the report, not just focused entirely on Muslim communities. They have to be part of all of it in order to find a way to bring everybody together so that people are in fact prepared to speak to people about this behavior with the hope that something can be done about it short of having it become a law enforcement solution. The federal government has a role. There's a grant program that has been started. That's a way to move forward. There are activities that have occurred in the Justice Department and the U.S. attorneys. Those are possible courses of action. But as you will see from this study, we think it really has to be grounded locally in communities and then supported by the federal government in order to create the ideas, the opportunities, and the trust that we think is necessary. Can we stop there and turn it over, please?
Thank you. Thank you. I want to thank Matt and the folks here for this great work. I also want to thank you for putting me in the middle and not relegating me to the far right of the table.
So to speak.
But let me just start. When Matt asked me to join the effort, I really did have to kind of think long and hard before I accepted. It was prior to the election, and frankly, I had some serious concerns that the direction of the report would move in a way that I was not comfortable and couldn't support. Away from law enforcement, away from recognizing that the problem of countering violent extremism rests with countering Islamist terrorism, towards a notion that violent extremism should be seen first and foremost as a public health issue. But even before the election of President Trump, Matt and his team, I have to say, were really bent on ensuring that there was an open dialogue on the committee and that the really hard questions were asked and answered, such as, do we think that the last 8 years of effort on understanding and curbing radicalization here at home were working? Answer, no, they weren't, not really. Should there be a more concerted effort to train and educate non-traditional, aka non-law enforcement, to help address the scourge? Answer, yes, certainly. So before I though, start laying out some of the recommendations that really speak to me and their underlying rationale, I want to remind the audience of an earlier time when we were just beginning to formulate the USG responses for dealing with the problem of violent extremism. So I'm not going to go back 50 years the way that Rand did, but in the immediate years after 9/11, our fundamental belief was that America is at war with a transnational terrorist movement fueled by a radical ideology of hatred, oppression, and murder. Those aren't my words. They are what is written in the 2006 U.S. government document, the National Strategy for Combating Terrorism, which was paraphrased from an earlier 2003 document. So let me repeat. America is at war with a transnational terrorist movement fueled by radical ideology of hatred, oppression, and murder. So I think those words still actually ring true. But the 2006 document continued that our strategy also recognizes that the war on terror is a different kind of war. From the beginning, it has been both a battle of arms and a battle of ideas. Not only do we fight our terrorist enemies on the battlefield, we promote freedom and human dignity as alternatives to the terrorist perverse vision of oppression and totalitarian rule. The paradigm for combating terrorism now involves the application of all elements of our national power and influence. Not only do we employ military power, we use diplomatic, financial, intelligence, and law enforcement activities to protect the homeland. We have broken old orthodoxies that once confined our counterterrorism efforts, end quote. So again, I have no problem with any of those words that were written over a decade ago. But here is where we are now. Over a decade from when that strategy was published, those concepts that we were promulgating need to be analyzed and assessed for what we are doing about preventing and countering radicalization of individuals here on the homeland. Something, frankly, we didn't really think that much about in 2006. But now we have over 10 years of data, of experimentation, and of smart, good people actually across the world focusing on ways to prevent and counter this threat. So, but still, there are a number of concepts in that earlier document that flow through to today, and I believe are made more relevant and more achievable given the ideas in the document released by the Washington Institute. So, for instance, during the second Bush administration, there was a clear push to enhance government architecture and interagency collaboration in order to reduce America's vulnerability to terrorism. But those efforts were almost exclusively, not completely, but almost exclusively focused on what the government could do for the country and not how the citizenry itself could be empowered and involved in its own protection. So back then, DHS was created, 22 federal entities brought together, DNI, Director of National Intelligence was created to integrate the efforts of the community, National Counterterrorism Center. The FBI was really transformed to focus more on preventing terrorism. Treasury created the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence to undercut threat financing. But what, again, was left out was the empowering of the American people in the endeavor. So the Washington Institute report, which I'm proud to be a part of, does call out that what is needed is a preventing and countering violent extremism concept that leverages not just a whole of government approach, but a whole of society approach that works really from the bottom up. In the report, we write that expressions of violent extremism and mobilization are by their nature very locally driven phenomena. So one quick point of not exactly a differing opinion, but I would say a differing emphasis, is that while I do believe that expressions of violent extremism and mobilization have a very local element, we would be wise not to lose focus on the transnational component. Back after 9/11 and through the Bush administration, there was a full court press to work with foreign partners in helping them establish the tools and capabilities to prevent and counter the growth and spread in their own of terrorism in their own countries. Ironically, I think it seems that we've spent so much effort helping our partners overseas that sometimes we miss the need for such programs here at home. And indeed, the current report finds that there's much U.S. policymakers could learn from America's foreign partners what they've done abroad, often with U.S. support. So while I don't think we should stop that overseas, certainly, we can learn a lot from it. And I do think we need to focus more on how some of the best of those programs can be imported back to the homeland. And granted, thankfully, the homegrown violent extremism threat in the U.S. is much, much lower in Europe. But we can learn, again, from those experiences. And not just in Europe, in the Middle East as well. There's a great program that the report calls out happening in Lebanon under the auspices of the organization Hayabina, Teach Women English. So they're teaching women English, but as they're teaching women English, they're also teaching women how to look for the very nascent behaviors that their sons, or their daughters, are exhibiting that might take them off course and into the arms of radicals waiting to recruit them. So basically, it's counterterrorism starts at home, I guess is what we could say. But I want to pause for one moment and reiterate a key part of this report. These community-based programs that are being recommended to prevent and counter violent extremism are a way to augment law enforcement, not supplant it. They must always be seen in the context of the global war on terror, so I really date myself. But truthfully, radicalization here at home cannot be seen as divorced from what is happening on the larger battlefield. And anyone, and we are not, suggesting that a school nurse or an English teacher is ever going to be fully equipped to recognize fully the signs of a nascent jihadi and do something about it, that would be, I think, clueless and reckless, and we are not suggesting that. But to get ahead, as the report suggests, the curve, and prevent the next homegrown violent extremism from being radicalized, it will be critical to empower communities on the front lines of defense against homegrown violent extremism and building trusting partnerships within local communities while augmenting, again, the connective tissue to law enforcement partners. And we heard this from the law enforcement that came to brief us, that it cannot only rest on their shoulders. It needs a broader base of support, and they need to be assisted in that. And that is where some of the public health style models can again be analyzed, looking at the experiments for the last 10 years, figuring out what works, and bringing them to a larger base of the population. One last comment before I give it back to Matt. Back in 2007, there was a CRS report that said increasingly analysts view terrorism as a process. Once it gains a foothold, it can become self-perpetuating with vested interests, funding sources, a microeconomy, recruitment, training, social outreach, and the means to expand. Thus, a process of terrorism that could potentially have been dislodged at an earlier stage with relative ease often becomes increasingly robust if left unchecked, particularly with respect to indoctrination of the young. So preventing and countering violent extremism, as described and defined in this report, is part of the answer in that early dislodgement, if done correctly. I just want to say it was, again, a real pleasure and honor to participate in this report. I look forward to continuing the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you very much, both of you. And this is very much the beginning of the conversation, which we're hoping to spark with this report. Let me put a little bit of meat in the bones of what we found, and open it up for conversation with all the panelists. Law enforcement is drinking from the fire hose right now in terms of the number of cases that are happening. And you can make a slight distinction here between dealing with kind of foreign directed attacks, stopping the next 9/11, and dealing with the homegrown violent extremist HVE threat at home. And so it's law enforcement, perhaps more than anybody else, maybe equal with people who are working in communities who are desperate for there to be systems, networks in place to move the needle earlier in the process. Right? What law enforcement doesn't want is for the fallback position to be, let's wait until someone goes far enough down the process of radicalization because of whatever combination, and it's always some combination, of grievance and ideology, of push and pull, and to the point where there actually is a threat, where it is a law enforcement issue. But by definition, and I started my career in FBI counterterrorism, we don't want law enforcement to be thought police. It is perfectly legal to engage in radical discussions. It is not illegal to observe Islamic State videos. Who can be occupying that space to deal with people before they are a law enforcement issue, before they've crossed that Rubicon? How can we move the needle earlier in the process? Now that law enforcement, that connective tissue of law enforcement is critical, and it cuts both ways. First of all, law enforcement will not always be in a position to be the first one to identify someone who's going through some type of crisis, going through a radicalization process. By the way, for whatever reason, for whatever ism. People in communities on the ground are much better positioned to be able to identify this. It reminds me, by the way, of the case of Boeri, the guy who killed Van Gogh. And when they went back to the community, everybody said, yeah, well, we saw this person go through a process. He became more radical and changed his dress and stopped going to certain mosques and went to more radical mosques and wouldn't talk to females, would cross the street, females coming with. Who were we supposed to report that to? None of that is illegal. That's the space we're trying to fill, and we're not trying to fill it with law enforcement or intelligence. This is not about spying. We're trying to fill this with people who can address those issues, networks as local as possible of professionals, those peers, those parents, those religious leaders, those teachers, those clinical social workers, those mental health workers, etc. And they will need to have that connective tissue to law enforcement, because when they see something that is disconcerting and is not responding to their efforts, they will have a duty to warn, and they will need to have that connective tissue. And on the flip side, FBI is desperate to have someone to hand off to. We've had at least 4 cases: Boston, Garland, Chelsea, New York, New Jersey, and Orlando, where the FBI and other law enforcement found out about someone, investigated them fully and properly, ran things down. There was nothing more to do, and under the law, the FBI had to and appropriately shut down those investigations. And there was no one for the FBI or the other law enforcement, because there was other law enforcement involved, to hand this off to saying, hey, listen, there's not a violation of the law here, but we've got some really disconcerting behaviors, of the type of someone saying that they're Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, Hezbollah, not knowing the difference between them, but wanting to be part of that in Omar Mateen, for example, and lots of other things in those other cases. To whom can the Bureau or others hand these things off to then have continued partnership? And how can it be done in such a way that communities feel comfortable with it, that they don't feel that this is now a part of a spying ring, something government-driven top-down? So this is what we tried to get into in the weeds here. Samantha talked about the all elements of national power idea, which we've been talking about for a long time and is critically important. We try and complement that here with a whole of society idea. Some of the most important actors to counter these threats are not going to be intelligence analysts. They're not going to be law enforcement officers or agents. They're going to be people who are working in their communities and are doing the things that we do day in and day out to build resilience within our communities, good governance, community policing, the types of things that we do to address all kinds of things affecting our society. And so we don't talk about this as a public health issue as such, we talk about it as a public health style issue. By that we mean the following. By preventing and countering violent extremism, we suggest something along the following model. Think of it in 3 basic tiers, much like a public health, primary, secondary, and tertiary model. At that very first level, you are extremely preventative. You are doing things in a very, very broad way. You're not focused on an ism, you're focused on a territory. You're focused in Montgomery County model, what's now called BRAVE, Building Resilience Against Violent Extremism, on a geographic area. And you'll be working in this school and that school. And in that school, you may come across cases of people drawn to MS-13, and you'll come across cases of people who are drawn to Islamist extremism, and a whole bunch of other isms. And you'll be there to intervene appropriately per ism. It's not going to be the same intervention for MS-13 as it will be for Islamist extremism, but you'll be there to do that. At the second level, you'll be able to dive down a little more specifically, again, still at the community level, when you see something specific happening in a community. Say a community in the Midwest that's seeing some far-right, maybe neo-Nazi activity, and you bring in a group like Life After Hate. Or you see things in the Somali American community in Minneapolis, and you bring in Kajug or others that have been started up there and do great work there. And that's a little bit more diving down into the particular ism, but it still is more at the community level. And then the next level is going to be not preventative, but countering. If you see someone getting on a path or already on the path to radicalization, you will intervene. You will off-ramp, and that will be at the individual level. And so there are lots of different ways to do this. Where possible, communities will build up networks of their own. Some might decide to have full-time networks. Most will probably decide to have networks of people who volunteer from the hospitals or elsewhere, or plug into NGOs that are operating like the BRAVE model here in Montgomery County and elsewhere in Maryland. Others may not have the ability to do that. And so we talk about the idea, for example, of having some type of fly team, either out of Washington or out of major metropolises around the world, around the country, where they could fly into a small community when there's a crisis, start the intervention with the individual, and also start building up the local capacity to do this on their own. There are lots of different ways to go about doing this. The idea is to make it as local as possible and to deal with communities as broadly as possible. Not just Muslim communities, not only because we're not only dealing with Islamist issues in our communities, but also because here in the United States, and Aaron Zellin, who's unable to be here today, has done a lot of work on this. Here in the United States, more so than in Europe, though it's happened in Europe too, a good number of the individuals who've been radicalized in an Islamist bent have been converts who are not necessarily part of their adoptive communities because they've been radicalized. And so they're not going to what you might refer to as mainstream mosques. And so they're not really part of those Muslim communities yet. We would miss some of the Islamist extremism if we were only focusing on the established Muslim communities. We talk about a variety of things here that I think we should mention. If you think about this preventing and countering spectrum, what we're trying to do is think about this from soup to nuts across the radicalization life cycle. And it's not just preventing people who have not yet become radicalized. It's not just dealing with people who have already become radicalized. Many of you, I hope, have seen Eric's recent op-ed in Time Magazine. If you haven't, you should, where he talks about, I think, a point that is really important in our report, and that is the rehabilitation and reintegration of people back into society. And, when you first have this conversation with many people, they think that's very, very soft. It's very, very mushy. We shouldn't be providing services to people who, say, maybe have been convicted of being engaged in supporting or engaging in some type of terrorist activity. We don't have the luxury of thinking that way. The Europeans certainly feel this in a very immediate way because of the significant number of foreign terrorist fighters, at least 6,000, who have gone from Europe, and many hundreds at least who have come back. We don't have quite that problem here, but we got another issue. Over the next 2 to 10 years, approximately 900 people who have been convicted of terrorism or terrorism-related offenses are going to complete their prison terms. The first person convicted on charges related to the Islamic State, she's going to be released next month. And we don't have right now counter-radicalization, CVE programs in our prisons. We don't have right now, though we're beginning to think about it, anything for post-release other than your basic parole system. And so we have an interest in making sure that we're thinking about these things even in the United States, and not because it's soft, because it's smart. At the end of the day, the reason to focus not only on Islamist extremism, though that presents a very clear threat, is because the way you actually operationalize these ideas at their most basic is geographic and community-wide. Now, we spoke to lots of people in lots of different spaces in this world, lots of different stakeholders, and we heard from some people in the clinical social worker, mental health communities about their concerns about this being too securitized and being too open and upfront about the law enforcement role. We believe strongly that there has to be some type of connective tissue. It doesn't mean that FBI has to be the front face when you're dealing with an issue locally in the community, but it's certainly you have to have that connective tissue. But we also think I had to remind in these conversations people who are coming from the service-oriented side of government that the fact is, I mean, you started with Vietnam, and then you started with 9/11. I'm going to start a little closer still. In April 2013, the only reason, as a government, the only reason this really became a huge issue towards the end of the Obama administration is because of the Boston Marathon bombing. As someone who's been focused on this since at least 2008, this is the third CVE report, bipartisan CVE report the Institute has done, this was not an issue at all in the beginning of the Obama administration. And it didn't become an issue because the service side of government, because the mental health workers and the clinical social workers said, hey, we got issues in our community. That's not why we're having this conversation. We're having it because of the Islamist nature of the threat that is being overlaid on top of these other threats across our communities. And as Rand said, as we now look at these, we're seeing, and there are several DHS reports that get to this, that the same types of markers that you can identify for people being radicalized to one type of thing, if you get early on enough in the process, there are similarities between them. Not everything will be applicable across the Islamist, far left, far right, but there's enough that makes it worthwhile looking at all these different things. We also grappled with issues like, is the term CVE too toxic? CVE now is a beltway term. If you go out of the Washington Beltway, nobody uses this term. Not even the three pilot programs that were established after the Boston Marathon bombing in LA, in Minneapolis, and Boston, and we spoke to those programs and many, many others. At the end of the day, we decided two things. We think it makes more sense to talk about PCVE because we think that CVE alone doesn't get to the preventive side enough, and the preventive side, the earlier you get, the more effective you can be. But also at the end of the day, there are two groups out there that have real issues with this. One of them, I'll describe them as haters gonna hate. And there's not much we're gonna be able to do about that. A much, much larger group is people who have very serious and legitimate concerns, whether it's about the things being overly securitized from their perspective, et cetera. And the answer to that is not to come up with a new term, but to put systems in place that address those concerns. Because at the end of the day, we could call this peanut butter. And if you don't do things that actually make people feel more comfortable with it, they're going to be uncomfortable with peanut butter. And we could rename it and fix those things that make people feel uncomfortable, and haters still going to hate. At the end of the day, this is something that makes sense for everybody. It's in the national interest. It's in the local interest. So how do we do this from a federal level? What's our role? What's our place? Finance, et cetera, to empower state and locals. That's what we grapple with here. And with that, I just want to once again thank all the members of the study group who put a lot of time and effort into this, debated things long and hard. I do want to stress that we have a caveat in here. This is bipartisan. No one person necessarily agrees with every single point in here. And kudos to everybody for getting to the point where everybody felt really comfortable with this report and signed on in full. And again, I just want to thank the Washington Institute staff, and in particular, our RAs and interns for making it possible. And with that, we'll open up to your Q&A. All right, I think we're going to have mics coming around. Are we going to have mics coming around? Or are we just talking out loud? What are we doing here? Mics are coming around? All right. Come on, I know you have questions. Mike Kraft is right here. Just wait for a mic.
Thanks very much for your good work. I have a couple of sort of practical questions, especially for Rand and Eric, who are most recently in government. One of them is, how do you measure success? I mean, in view of Chairman McFaul's criticism, et cetera, and it seems to me from having worked on previous types of these issues, it's very hard to measure, because if somebody steps back from being radicalized, he doesn't actually call up the FBI or DHS and say, hey, you guys convinced me. And then second of all, can you talk about the coordination problems? At first, or earlier on, there seemed to be problems between the FBI and DHS. I mean, we've heard stories they're going to the same community groups. And I think a task force was finally formed. Could you describe how the coordination mechanism is working, and do you think it is working?
Eric, you want to jump in?
Sure. On the good questions, on the, I mean, Rand obviously has a much deeper perspective in terms of the DHS involvement here. But in terms of how do you measure success, you have to first start with the question of you have to have programs to actually assess. And one of the huge sort of the catch-22 in CVE domestically is that Congress wouldn't fund anything until there were better indicators of success, but you couldn't actually show any success because there were no programs. And there are lots of programs overseas that were funded over the last 3 years, increasing numbers, because the State Department was able to convince Congress that despite this perception that CVE is very soft and mushy, that if you're talking about prison rehabilitation, if you're talking about one-on-one interventions, if you're talking about measuring attitudinal shifts towards violence and towards the other, there are internationally have been successful programs in that area, and not just in Europe, but elsewhere. But I think fundamentally the question has to be, we haven't had a lot of success bombing in Iraq and elsewhere over the last 15 years, but that doesn't seem to stop more resources being invested in those efforts. So why can't we just be a little bit more open to a little risk-taking with a lot smaller amounts of money in terms of this prevention effort? And that, I think, is really, we're not going to actually, I don't think, ever be able to come up with the kinds of indicators, the kinds of measurements that appropriators are demanding. I think we really have to just convince them and others who are skeptical about this that what do we have to lose? We have never tried this in any meaningful way. Let's try it for a couple of years. Let's seed some programs, and then let's come back in a couple of years and see what kinds of results we can demonstrate. So that's the first question. And the second question on the coordination, I would just say that from my perspective, and I was sort of in the government, but not in the domestic side, of the international side, but I was watching it very carefully, is that a lot of the shortcomings were not so much agency to agency, but it was from the White House, and that there was not enough clear direction from the White House about who should be doing what, when, and why, and that it was left to agencies, therefore, to sort of chart their own course. That left some gaps, like in Bureau of Prisons, and that left some redundancies, like in terms of DHS and DOJ both engaging at the community level, often with stepping on each other's toes. So, but I will let Rand elaborate on certainly the last point.
Yeah, Mike, good questions. Let me do a little bit on the first point, but I'm going to focus on the second. One of the things that this report recommends is that this be a whole of government and whole of society effort. In that recommendation is embedded the more direct involvement on the part of both the mental health, social work, and educational communities. While we don't have good measurements now, and any measurements we might come up with are indirect, how does society, how do communities feel about the sense of public safety, and is government helping them? That doesn't measure, as you point out, an individual deciding not to follow that path. So one of the things that we are hoping will come out of this is that those communities who have done a lot of social science research will be able to
help think more specifically about this. With respect to the task force, is very much still a work in progress. The involvement of the Department of Health and Human Services and Education has been a very slow process, but in terms of some of the outreach that we've done as a result of this report, it appears that they are thinking harder and about being involved in this effort, and if they are, that I think will complete a process that was only nascent when the task force itself was begun several years ago. Thank you.
I'll just add that so far what we've basically done is we've told people go do things and we haven't been funding them. So we had 3 pilot programs. They were informed. They weren't volunteers. Do things, and by the way, we're giving you no money, and we're going to be back to evaluate what you're doing with the money we're not giving you.
Can I just say one thing?
Let me just make one, and then absolutely. B, there is the beginning of evaluations. The BRAVE model has been evaluated once. The National Institute of Justice has started working in the space. This is metrics and evaluation is critical, and you can read about that very much so in the report. And finally, we do have some very specific structural recommendations for the task force. And whether you agree with the specifics of what we recommend or not, the idea is how to kind of force the service side of government to play a bigger role, be more of a stakeholder in the task force itself without minimizing or watering down the law enforcement roles that task force is playing. So far, as Eric said, without a whole lot of top-down White House direction, leaving it up to the agencies, we haven't gotten a whole bunch of social service agencies to volunteer and really step up in this space. But one thing everybody has been saying to us as we've been rolling out the report is there is concern. The president's proposed budget is just a proposed budget, but trying to get service agencies, well, it affects everybody, but service agencies in particular, to step up in a bigger way at a time when budgets are being slashed could be difficult. Samantha?
I just want to add one quick comment. I actually, am quite optimistic that you could put together a serious research design, even though there's small numbers, and do some serious social science research on this. And I hope the big foundations, it doesn't have to be government funded. I mean, I hope the big foundations that fund social science research on unwed pregnancies to families to whatever that they throw millions and millions and millions of dollars at every year would read this and get over their squeamishness and actually do some funding of some serious social science research on this. It doesn't always have to come back to the government.
Generally, throughout the report, we talk about the fact that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. There are a bunch of federal agencies that kind of have some work in this space, whether it's violence prevention, public health, or other things that could be looped in. There are state and local. There are umbrella organizations for police and sheriffs and governors and mayors, and certainly in the academic, and we even talk about the philanthropic and private sectors as well. Right over here, please.
Thank you all for your good work. I have a question with respect to how you consider the impact of the way the Muslim community is described in political terms so often in the United States. And I note that in your report you refer to the political correctness of recent years, which in itself becomes a point of political correctness, where in your summary you talk about the so-called Islamic State, and there's go back and forth as to what the term Islamist really means. And I wonder how you think for these sorts of efforts that you describe to be successful, which requires the cooperation of the Muslim community, what you think the impact is, or of how so many political figures describe the Muslim community, and how you think that conversation should take place if, as I expect all of you believe, that the Muslim as a religion, many of them are perfectly peaceful and the like, and you have terrorists within the community, but if you have your president and major politicians talking the way they do about that community, what will be the impact on these sorts of efforts eliciting or preventing cooperation from the community.
Anybody want to jump in on this? Don't all jump up at once. Okay, I'll start, and people can jump in. We do discuss in the report that one of the biggest things we're trying to do here is build trust within communities and between communities and government, local, state, federal. So we should choose terminology that is not so politically correct that it's meaningless. And we call to task the previous administration for not being willing to talk about Islamist or jihadist terrorism. But we also talk about the fact that you got to use terminology that resonates or at a minimum isn't insulting to the people you are trying to draw in. Especially, by the way, when we're talking, whatever ism it is, if we're talking about immigrant communities, often people from parts of the world where a good day is a day where you don't have any interaction with law enforcement or government. You're trying to build that trust, build that faith. We have in our one of our first footnotes, and this was a bipartisan effort, and so it's in the report, but it's in a footnote 2, talking about this issue in terms of language. I think it's very important to use terms like Islamist and not Islamic. To me, Islamic refers to a religion, its institutions, and adherents. Islamist is a political ideology and gets to this issue of the vast majority of Muslims are not involved in these terrible activities, but it's happening within it. But it also gets to the point that, government isn't very good, and for other reasons shouldn't, but really let's get to the point, isn't very good at having these discussions and debates about religion. But there is a slice of this, right? The Islamic State calls itself Islamic. Whether it is or it calls itself. And the people who can get into this discussion, that's not us. It's the partners we need on the ground. And that's true for other isms as well. And so I think it's really important, this issue of trust, building that trust. How do you do things that build trust? Now, how do you do it in such a way it doesn't really water things down either? I think it was Rand who talked about the need to have an ability for people who don't yet fully have that trust, for example, to have other people, instead of walking up to a police officer or a federal agent, not because they're bad, but because maybe people don't have that comfort level yet, who else could you go up to and reach out and say something that will then have connective tissue to law enforcement? So this is something I think is central to the report. And I think it's important to think about how we talk about these things. There's language we should use, and there's language that is not helpful. And I would argue that the term Islamist is in no way whatsoever somehow weaker than the term Islamic, and that the term Islamic actually doesn't do anything for us. And I understand that the National Security Advisor apparently would agree with that. Anybody else want to jump in? Adnan?
I think when you talk about some of the national conversations that are taking place and the impact those are having, it goes back to Osama bin Laden, the us versus them narrative. We've learned a lot about how to counter narratives, how to put forward credible voices. And the one thing we have consistently learned, whether it's post 9/11 or 06 or 2013 or 50 years ago, is words matter. And how you use words matters. So my short answer to you would be some of the national conversation from our national leaders is abysmal, and it's hurting us, and it's actually destroying relationships with exactly the kinds of community leaders we need to be engaging. That's one. Two, it's just setting us backwards, because what we've been able to learn since 9/11 is what the narratives are that groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and others and other violent extremist groups are using to recruit. And these are pretty consistently about an us versus them. You are part of a community, and therefore let me tell you how to act in that community versus the other. And so the more we have a national sort of dialogue on that comes from that place, I think the more it hurts us. And this report, again, Matt, thank you, and Rob, and for the Institute for putting this report forward at such a critical time. I think it draws it out. I think it calls people out and says, don't go down that path. We've learned a lot. Let's build on what we've learned.
Okay, we had Maureen, and we'll come over here.
Thanks, Matt. Mahreen Farouk from the Center for Health and Homeland Security. First of all, I want to commend you all for a monumental task, and I think the report is great, and I really do appreciate your effort at raising attention to this issue, because I think without these types of reports, we can't garner the necessary political and social capital to these issues. I'll also have to say shamelessly that we do also appreciate the plug for the BRAVE model.
Never heard of it.
Never heard of it. We're doing great things. But I guess, to speak very frankly, I have to say that from a practitioner perspective, one of the things that is quite disappointing is the fact that we have a handful of models that we can really point to that are evidence-based or community-led, or which have really kind of gotten off the ground. And I think that really speaks volumes, whether it's the community limitations in terms of their institutional capacity, or some of the political discourses that have really stifled progress on this issue. So I guess my question is we've had a lot of positive feedback from jurisdictions across the US about taking some of the lessons learned in this community-led approach that we've piloted in Montgomery County to really develop this elsewhere. Of course, funding becomes an issue, and I appreciate your recommendation for kind of addressing this issue within the broader public safety emergency management infrastructure. We were very successful in doing that in Maryland, but other states may be a little bit less hesitant, maybe a little bit more hesitant to do that. So my question is, especially for those policymakers that are here in the room today, is when the next RFP comes out, whether it's at the federal, state, or local levels, how can we really encourage this holistic, multidisciplinary approach to countering a very complex social problem?
Go ahead.
I think first of all, I would broaden the way you ask the question and say it's not just government. I think it's also the private sector. I think that Facebook, to its own credit, has acknowledged this and has funded some programs in this space about messaging and about teaching. Other parts of this community and philanthropic organizations, going back to a comment that was made more generally here, have to think about this as a space in which they should consider operating and supporting and funding, so that all of the seed money, so to speak, doesn't have to come from a grant program that's run by the federal government, but is also seen as a legitimate philanthropic kind of activity to bring society together. The research that you talked about that people have done in terms of unwed pregnancies and things like that, this is another example about how to think about the whole of society and how can philanthropic organizations. And the third area that I think we need more effort in, and it isn't necessarily funding, but it is in fact an area to broaden the discussion, and that is each of the sectors that could be involved in this have vertical structures that are national, state, and local. So the National Governors Association, the Council of Mayors, the city, the county commissioners, the educational institutions, of which there are many, the mental health and social work communities, of which there are many. All of these organizations can look at this as something that's part of their own mission and proselytize more broadly, which will then, I think, make it more comfortable for philanthropic communities to become involved in this effort. Because the federal government isn't going to do it alone.
Eric?
And I think just to broaden it in a different way, I think one of the challenges I think in this country is that for most communities, violent extremism is not even close to the biggest concern. And one of the sort of unintended consequences of developing a CVE, federal CVE program with federal CVE money is that you're saying, okay, if you want to deal with CVE in your community, you have to label it CVE or at least get money from a CVE pot and collaborate with the CVE task force in Washington, when you may have other prevention efforts underway for other, whether it's it's drugs, it's other criminal activity, or other things that of concern to family members in the community that you could add a CVE dimension to, but that is difficult to do because right now, because of this unfortunate divide between the law enforcement CVE world and the broader public health and community resilience world. And I think a lot of the recommendations in our report are designed to break down that divide, and if you can break down that divide, it'll be easier for private sector to come in, it'll be easier for all these other actors who have been so resistant to engage because of the clear association between CVE and law enforcement, which rightly or wrongly they perceive as a barrier to their involvement.
Matt, just very quickly, be careful what you wish for. When Samantha and I were in government, it was there were many, many conversations where we would say, if only someone on the outside would be able to could do this more creatively. Peter, you were in those conversations as well from state. If only there was some innovative group or someone on the outside who could do this without all the bureaucratic nonsense that sometimes government has to deal with, wouldn't that be amazing? Well, lo and behold, we've kind of come up with a structure where in DC, we've almost centralized the thought process into what Eric, you were saying, CVE. And it has its own baggage where it's really hard to come up with measurements and it's really hard to come up with ways to measure because it's such a top-down, it has become a top-down grant-making process. That can be improved as long as we don't go backwards. That can totally be improved and refined and evolved. But at the same time, the positive externality is that you've gotten a lot of philanthropists and small foundations like GenNext, which is one that I work for, who've gotten involved. And these are really people who are not seeking government funding, but they're really interested in securing our future for the next generation. And we should not undercut that energy, the all of society energy that is out there, people who really do want to contribute in some way, shape, or form. Tech companies, Facebook, they're learning on their own how to deal with this issue. Google and Jigsaw, their incubator, they're learning on their own how to do this. There is a role for government and for DC-based policymakers to play to activate more of that, to get more people engaged, to be able to come up with measurements that make sense, that are real-world based, that do touch on what Rand was saying earlier about mental health, social work. Even I would throw in artificial intelligence. There are all kinds of areas where all elements of national power can be engaged.
Excellent. Right here in the middle, please.
Thank you very much. I haven't had the opportunity to read your report yet, but I can see it's going to be really, really helpful. I appreciate your presentation, and I wanted to ask you about the non-Islamist Muslims in the community of the United States. How can we empower them to stand up for their rights within the Muslim community? Because I feel like they are just as much at risk, or probably more, than the rest of us in terms of radicalization and demonization. And my second question is about cutting off the source of radicalization before we get to the point of what you've been discussing here, and where could that come from? For example, could it come from Congress and some of the bills that they have right now in Congress? And I know that's not your forte, but perhaps you could comment on whether or not that the Muslim Brotherhood Designation Act or such bills would be something that you think would be helpful to stop at the root cause. Thank you.
Anybody? Okay. Matt Bus. Look, I think this whole project is about empowering people across society to be able to figure out how they can play a role in this. And I think it is fair to say that, again, we're talking about beyond any one particular ism, but for the vast majority of Muslims who are not engaged in the violence or the radicalization, how to reclaim their space. And this is an effort to empower them and to figure out how we can work with them. I tend to think that we in Washington tend to assume Muslims aren't doing very much. And if you actually get out there, you find out Muslims are doing a whole lot. It's just that doesn't make good news. And so we don't hear all that much about it. And there are some people who they're wary, they're uncomfortable. It comes down to that trust. But there are all kinds of programs that are going on, and we need to be empowering those. That's a given, and I would argue it gets into the other spaces, the other types of isms as well. I also tend to think that this idea of cutting things off at the source is under the category of wouldn't it be great if? You know, we used to say, wouldn't it be great if we could just break Syria off from its partner in Iran? Yeah, wouldn't it be great if? Wouldn't it be great if we could just cut things off at the source? There's no cutting things off at the source anymore. There are no boundaries. There's an internet. It's not only about travel. There's a piece to it in travel, certainly. You're not going to cut things off at the source in that way. I personally thought that the idea of designating the Muslim Brotherhood was a terrible idea. Not because the Muslim Brotherhood are good guys or looking out for our best interests, but they're not a terrorist group. They're actually not a unitary group at all, and those parts of them that are terrorists either have been or should be designated a la Hamas. But it's a misunderstanding. It's an oversimplification of the Muslim Brotherhood to describe it as terrorist. I also don't like the idea that if you're a problematic, you have to be terrorist. We're talking about moving the needle earlier in the process. One of the things we discussed and debated a lot was whether the report should be referring throughout to combating violent extremism, which is how we refer to it, or countering extremism. And in the end, we have in the recommendations language that we've actually used in some of our other reports about the need not to criminalize thought or discussion, including radical, obnoxious discussion, but to contest it. And we don't say this precisely in the report, but the example I like to give is smoking. Smoking is legal. Maybe you can't do it in certain places, certain times, but it's legal. But government doesn't shy away from spending state, local, federal money to educate you to the ills of smoking, how it's bad for you, how it's bad for the person next to you, and it's bad for all of us as taxpayers. We don't shy away from doing that just because the act itself is legal. We're not going to be criminalizing ideas in this country, I hope. That's not who we are. But we should not say, well, we can't criminalize it, so there's nothing we can do. We should contest dangerous ideas. And that's something different, and I wish people would think about that when it comes to Muslim Brotherhood types of organizations, as opposed to criminalizing, designating. It's more complicated than that. And so I think that one of the things we try and do here is figure out where that space is. And for us, CVE really does have to focus on violent extremism. The more you move things early in the process, the more you move that needle, the more you have partners, local and community, they are the best place to be able to engage in that battle of ideas, which government, frankly, isn't as good at. Anybody want to add anything?
Yeah, this is anecdotal, and so take it as this, but in conversations that I have had around the country with individuals who have been interested in contesting this space, one of the comments that I got, several of the comments that I got were individuals who early on in the effort to prevent or counter violent extremism and to protect our citizenry, because of the space in which they operated and the people to whom they talked, had investigations opened against them and have been on the secondary inspection list if they travel internationally. And as that gets spoken about within the community, it creates the reserve that I talked about earlier in general terms of working with the police. But it also gives the sense of if you participate in this and contest in this space, you may end up getting a label. Now that, I hope, has gone away in large measure because these conversations occurred at the beginning of the Obama administration. But it is a fact that at one time at least was the case and caused people to step back and not want to play in this space and possibly be identified in some way as conspirators.
It's also happening with parents who have children that have gone over to support ISIS
Yes. Yeah. So we're trying to be not to be too wonkish on the panel, but in the report we get into these issues. There is concern among people, like where does the material support statute begin and end for people who want to work in this space? There's yet to be a conversation about insurance. Let's say I volunteer to work in this space, and let's say that I'm very successful and I de-radicalize Rand here, and he's an upstanding and contributing member of society for the next 5 years, and then the next Syria or whatever it is, something else happens, and that person that I worked with gets radicalized again, and God forbid does something. Am I liable? You can laugh about it, but people that we're asking to step up in the space, that's a real question for them. And similarly, things like duty to warn. Professionals have a duty to warn. That's not standard across the country by any stretch of the imagination. And so as you're trying to build rapport, not only communities having trust in law enforcement, you're asking law enforcement to kind of give up a little bit of space or partner with others who are outside. They have to feel trust with the communities and the actors in the communities that they're partnering with. They need to feel that everybody has an equal understanding of where exactly is the duty to warn, so that law enforcement can feel if something happens, we're comfortable that you're going to come to us at the appropriate time and in time. So these are some of the kind of wonky things we get to in the report too. We have a mic up here for Peter. They're not wonky. They're wonky.
This is maybe more specific, and it's teeing off early observation that Matt made about the 900 people that are in jail for radicalization related crimes, and something Rand said about national associations as a vehicle, which strikes me as very astute. I'm coming from previous work in kind of the CVE, strategic information field, but also informally a fairly long-term friendship last decade with the LA FBI office that were located right next to my office in the federal building. Their concern, and again, this is very Southern California context, is that people were radicalizing like crazy in jail. And it was not only Hispanic gangs they were worried about. They were worried about actually people that had access to the internet in jail, getting onto ISIS, or that was a little pre-ISIS radical sites, but also people that might be in jail for that sort of crime infecting the population. We know it's a sector in this society, I don't think anyone in this room is going to disagree, that needs a lot of reform. The second thing, my second perspective is that I launched a project to teach meditation-based stress reduction in local jails about 8 years ago, and I'm in jail at least twice a week, so to speak. And I really, the facility I happen to coordinate in this project is a model facility. It's the Montgomery County Pre-Release Center. And at the same time, I hear expressions in there that I would say are one ounce of specificity shy of triggering me to go and talk to someone. And these are people that are carefully selected and vetted from state and county jails to participate in this program. This is a kind of an elite program to reintegrate people. So I worry about that. I worry about that, and I think that, yes, we're involving local police in trainings and BRAVE and so forth, but at the same time, I really feel we need to be talking to prison caseworkers and guards and so forth.
Sure, go ahead.
Peter, absolutely. Prison radicalization, and not just Islamist or jihadists, but white supremacists, neo-Nazi radicalization is I don't want to say widespread, but it's huge. There's a program in Southern California called Crossroads, which, if you're not familiar with, is definitely a prototype program that LAPD is doing with the prison system. I think one thing I do want to pick up related to this, what Samantha said earlier, is, we have done, as a government, I can't say we, but as a government, our country has done a lot overseas on de-radicalization. It is not fair for anyone on the Hill to say that our programs have failed, sort of blanket failed. We've done a lot of things overseas. We've set up incubators all over the planet. And as Samantha said, it's really time to start bringing some of those lessons home. Hayat out in Europe is a fantastic program for de-radicalization. Exit does great work. That does exist in the U.S., but we need to do a lot more and learn from what we've actually seeded overseas. And we have looked at prisons overseas. We're not doing the same thing here at home. So there's a disconnect, but I'm confident that if people carefully read this report, digest it, and implement every recommendation to the letter, that we will we will get on that path.
You'll tell me how much I owe you later. Can we have a mic for David, please?
Thank you. I'm Dave Pollack here at the Washington Institute, and I wanted to ask, what about the role of religious leaders specifically? I know, as some of you have said, that government and religion don't mix that well here in the United States. But still, if this is to some extent an Islamist issue, a jihadi issue, what role do you see for mosques, for imams, for moderate Islam or reformed Islam or other kinds of Islam, specifically in dealing with the underlying issues here? And if I may, just a quick second question, which is not directly related. I noticed that on the beautiful program that we all have in front of us is the Statue of Liberty. So I wanted to ask you if any of you sees any connection between all of this and the current debate over immigration here in the United States.
Anybody want to start with the first question? role of religious leaders? Good.
Yes, religious leaders have a huge role to play, in my view, and I think that. But there are ways that government can encourage that, and there are ways that government, I think, should not encourage it. So, I am not a believer in the U.S. State Department, and they can't hide behind saying that we're doing it overseas, so it's okay. So I'm not in favor of the State Department going overseas and picking and choosing which forms of Islam to invite to embassy functions. I think that is dangerous and we shouldn't do it. At the same time, we should be creating spaces where religious leaders are engaging with other community leaders, right? Business leaders and entrepreneurs and young people who are not necessarily Islamic scholars, but are also leaders in their communities. And we should be creating spaces, and we've done a lot of this overseas, but we should do a lot more of it. We should encourage that kind of dialogue. And this is not, you don't get to nonviolence through legislating it or through telling people to be nonviolent. You get there by actually having a dialectic and actually having a conversation and allowing people to express their views in a safe way, so they're not thrown off the top of buildings. That was a crude statement, but that's the kind of stuff we ought to be looking out for. Our role as a government should be defending human rights, should be defending electoral processes, should be defending the rule of law, and not to sort of make this about economic development or USAID overseas, but there's a role for us to play where we can create those spaces, and there should not be a role for us to play in picking and choosing different religions. And by the way, we should be doing the exact same thing here at home. Government has no place opining about which religion should do X, Y, Z. I just don't. And we should likewise not denigrate a religion as a government. But that may be a slightly larger conversation.
In those same communities in which there is a responsibility within the mosque, I think there's also a responsibility basically under our principle of freedom of religion for it to also be an ecumenical discussion so that the community as a whole is respectful of each and every one of those religious organizations and makes them feel comfortable within the community as well.
Yeah. I'll just add on the immigration issue. It's undeniable that this has played a role in the discussion, and people can argue whether that's real or perceived. What's real, for example, is that 4 groups that competed for DHS grants, won those DHS grants, have pulled out or announced that they're pulling out. Others are in a wait-and-see mode, and that is largely because of how they perceive the immigration issue, the travel ban issue, perceived as a Muslim ban issue. Where everyone is in the political spectrum, I think it's important to recognize that has had a tangible impact on the ability to build that trust. And with the rollout of this first grant program, which so many people, including people on this panel, not me, worked so very hard to make happen. We did not choose the graphic for that reason. It's just a nice graphic for a transition paper. But there's no denying that this is something that we're grappling with at the same time. So we have right here, and then we're going to go here, and then we're going to come back here. So if we can have a mic right there.
Thank you, Matt and panel, for a really timely report, and one that's going to be, I think, very, very useful in the field. This is really good that you're focusing on the prevention side of things and highlighting that. My name is Paul McCarthy. I'm with the International Republican Institute, IRI. Over the past year, IRI has increasingly focused in the PCVE realm, particularly on, as your report points out, the CVE relevant as opposed to CVE specific realm. We have done a lot of work over the years on strengthening governments, making communities more resilient, and so forth. What we've been doing over the past year has been a lot of research in the form of public opinion surveys, also focus groups, and in-depth interviews in countries around the world, namely in the Western Balkans, in Tunisia, in Bangladesh as well, and in other countries. So our focus is international. From my perch, I work in the Europe division, and one of our focuses is on building transatlantic cooperation on issues. And we just met with a delegation from the European Parliament. It was clear that they wanted to share information on security-related issues, but specifically about CVE. And they understand also that this may be a way to make better linkages to the current administration to be talking about these things. So it's very much on their radar screen and has been. My question has to do with what can we learn from the European experience? Are there efforts, either governmental or non-governmental, that we can turn to as models to learn from? Which would you point out? And also, if there are any caveats in the European experience that you could point out that we should stay away from, because we're trying to learn from people's good work and mistakes. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm going to ask Eric to start with this.
In the report, there's a couple of pages where we talk about some of the lessons that the European approach could teach us, and it starts all the way up from at the level of the European Commission in terms of the policy framework in which they provide for the European Union in terms of dealing with on prevention, and it brings in all different kinds of ministries explicitly beyond the interior ministries. So it's bringing in social services, it's bringing in sports ministries, it's bringing in education ministries with specific funding streams associated with that. So it's really a model in terms of the normative framework level. They have networks galore on these issues across the continent in terms of around radicalization awareness, that connecting practitioners, frontline practitioners with academics, with social workers, and that has also a vertical piece where the networks, recommendations, good practices, best practices, and so forth get channeled up to policymakers. We have nothing like that in this country. And then you have cities around you have probably more than a dozen now European Union members that have national CVE or PVE framework strategies that have funding streams associated with it, often, again, not just through security ministries, but also through the non-security actors. And then at the city level, there are dozens and dozens now, literally, of cities that are developing local programs, again, because there's this infrastructure in place to support that, both funding, expertise, and it's not just CVE-specific programs. It's integrating CVE programs into broader social cohesion, broader community resilience programs. So there's literally probably, for any kind of program a city or a community wants to develop in this country, there's a model somewhere in Europe. The issue, of course, is that is tapping into those resources in Europe, and because of the way the federal government has been operating in this space for the last few years, it's been really a hydra-headed engagement with Europe on this subject. State Department, DHS, FBI, it's just been not very coherent. But the bigger issue for me is that the threat level in Europe is much higher than it is here, so the political appetite at the local and national level for sort of investing serious resources in this problem is much greater in Europe than it is here. So you don't have a lot of the political sensitivities there, or they run roughshod over them, that you have here. And the last point I would mention is be wary of the UK PREVENT model and the Channel program. It's often touted as a sort of singular good practice for how a country has soup to nuts developed this comprehensive program, but it is fraught with complications. It's received a lot of pushback from Muslim communities around the country, and it's the legal framework in the UK and the national structure, the way the national government relates to local authorities is totally the opposite of how our federal structure works. So everything is London-driven and dictated down, and that's just the way their system works. And it imposes a duty on all sorts of teachers, doctors, et cetera, to report, a legal duty to report signs of radicalization to the local PREVENT officers in the community, which, again, huge backlash from the education sector, from the medical sector. And so the UK loves to tout that as the model for a national program. I would just be very leery of it.
Please.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, as you evaluate programs, I mean, pushback from a community certainly should be considered, but the bigger question is it effective or not, right? I mean, that's the goal. It's not you know, I'd say the sensitivities of a community. If they push back and it's not effective, then it's not effective. If they push back, but it's a very effective program, then I'd say they just have to get over it, you know, because it's a very effective program. But when kind of also analyzing, do programs, you know, in the continent are working, and could we import them here? We have very different constraints on law enforcement intelligence gathering here that they don't have over there. So, you know, again, a variable, exogenous, endogenous, has to be thought through as to whether or not those programs, the ones that work and the ones that don't, could come here given our different constraints on law enforcement intelligence gathering.
Just a quick two-finger. One of the challenges I think this federal task force has here is that there's no permanent State Department representative on the task force, and the reason why there's no permanent State Department representative on the task force is funding. So,
funding cuts to a variety of things on the task force, including the ability to get more local representation, to get more people out deployed from DC, which are things we talk about in the report. Two quick comments on this is just one, I agree with Eric's warning that the UK model won't just fit like a Lego piece here, but I still like to say to people, getting to some issues we discussed earlier in terms of the lack of programs we have here, the discomfort some on the Hill have of providing funding for programs that have not yet proven themselves because they haven't been funded. I like to say we're still about 2 PREVENT programs behind. What I mean by that is not to say what we should be doing PREVENT here, but rather to say in Europe, because of the nature of the threat, there's been more of a willingness to try and even error. And we don't have that much kind of a political culture in this country. The other thing that's interesting is we're having conversations in the wake of the release of the report there's a very interesting conversation. We don't really know where budget and funding is going to end up in this administration, but it seems to be clear that one theme is that this administration is going to ask our foreign partners, without denigrating the importance, say, of NATO, to pay for more. And that some people are thinking within the CVE space, maybe we should be breaking out the funding pots for CVE domestic and CVE abroad, because there might be, under this administration, some people are thinking, a greater willingness maybe to do some things at home with our own money, and less of a willingness to fund provide as much funding for some of the things we've been doing abroad, which is an interesting thing to consider as we move forward. What I'd like to do now, if the people with the mics will tolerate, is I'd like to ask, we have 2 questions, I'd like to ask 2 questions, and then we'll answer them together. I want to make sure we get them in. So the first question is this gentleman over here, and then right over here is the second question.
Hi, thank you. I'm Abdul Rijal with the Global Engagement Center, working on East Africa programs. And I have a quick comment and question. The quick comment is going back to using the new terminology and the impact that we see today. You mentioned Chertoff organization in Minneapolis, Somali American youth-led organization. And 2 months ago, they rejected like $500,000 from the DHS because of the rhetoric that's coming from our leadership. So that's something to comment on that. And we're having the same problem with our partners back in East Africa and many parts of the world. My question goes back to the CVE versus state-sponsored propaganda. And now we know the NDA, the National Defense Authorization Act, has been signed, and this is where the State Department is moving towards that. So we have CVE versus or both sides, doing that. Where do you see within the next couple of years? Do you see that's a huge national security problem for the U.S.? And if you compare CVE versus state-sponsored, namely the Russians, and knowing the current environment, the political environment, the U.S. today.
Okay, let's take the second question before we answer.
Yes, hi.
Oh, you have a mic.
Yeah. Maggie Davis with the Center for Health and Homeland Security, also the BRAVE program. I had a question tying together a couple themes from the panel today. So we spoke a lot about funding streams and how the federal grant system cannot be the only source of funding, which I completely agree with. We do need diversified funding to have all of these partners engaged. However, so far a lot of the private funding has been focused on that entity's small sliver of the CVE space. Using Facebook as an example, they tend to be focused on the social media counter-messaging, counter-narrative. How do we focus the broader conversation to have a holistic approach with private funding? How can we find a way to navigate kind of an interdisciplinary private funding model that's not that piecemeal approach of just one slice of the pie?
All right, great questions. Anybody want to jump in on any of them? Okay, I'll start, and you guys will come up with some ideas. So Abdul, glad you're here. The counter-messaging piece is critically important, and we talk about that at several points in the report in the ideology section, on the connectivity to the transnational nature of things that Samantha talked about. Look, we don't talk about the Russia issue here. That's something different. There is a need to push back on dangerous, false, propagandized ideas as they permeate across borders on the internet. There's no question about that. I think that the Global Engagement Center has a little bit of work cut out for it, in making the case more publicly in what it's done so far, because it hasn't been very public about it, in the space that we're talking about here, and it's done some good work. And of course, now with the NDA dumping a whole nother world on its plate, you could make an argument that there's an overlap here in particular with Iran, and there's a piece there more than with Russia, and that'll be interesting to watch. But there's no question. I think the simple answer is state and sub-state actors will do this a little differently, but they're using the same types of tools to get their message out, and some of these things might be transferable. Maggie, yes. We need to diversify our funding streams, and we need to find ways to get people interested beyond the sliver in which they live. That's going to be really hard. So maybe we need to think of it differently, and maybe we need to think of it, for example, as I have in Minneapolis, geographically. There it's been a little bit personality-driven, but the former U.S. attorney, who was very invested in these issues, reached out to companies that are based in or have a large footprint in Minnesota and said, hey, we got an issue here. And they got people to step up, and they created an NGO so that those companies were not giving money to the federal government or taking a risk with any particular
subcontractor. They were investing in the larger umbrella NGO, and the NGO was then vetting and partnering, et cetera, with metrics, with evaluation. It's not so easy, though. They haven't had an easy job of it in Minnesota, and you'd think that it would be a little bit easier there because they've had a little bit more of an acute threat there. Their words, by the way, in my conversations with officials there, not mine. As you go to other communities where they don't feel as threatened, not by the terrorist Islamist variation, because it hasn't happened there as much, and if there has been a case, if the FBI has arrested and prevented something, and we tend, as Samantha's pointed out, we tend to not be as fearful of the far right and the far left or other things, not because they're less dangerous, but because we've had them for a long time and they scare us less, right? Many, 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 many more people are killed in this country by cars, pedestrians. A new report just came out. The number of pedestrians killed far exceeds the number of killed in far left, far right Islamists. Put them all together. But we don't tend to lose sleep over that because we're used to cars. So this is going to be very difficult. It involves going out to communities and making the case that it's in your interest to build these resilient communities. Eric has talked about, for example, whether it's here or abroad, if a Coca-Cola or a Pepsi or whatever company, it's in their interest to have a stable community, for people to be able to not have to worry about other things and go to work, feel safe when they go to work, but that is going to be more effective in communities where people aren't feeling that safety. And when, especially here in the United States, where we tend to feel fairly safe, that's going to be, I think, a bigger lift. Anybody else?
Just a couple of things on the last, on your question, Maggie, which is, I think one of the lessons learned from engagement with the tech and social media sector over the last 4 or 5 years has been that, the private sector doesn't like to be told what to do by the federal government, particularly the national security side of the federal government. And they certainly don't like to be told what to do by the federal government by 5 different cabinet secretaries, the White House, and half a dozen other senior officials in Washington on separate occasions with slightly different messages. So I think one of the hopes is that if sort of the ethos of our report is accepted by stakeholders, is that this can happen, sort of the non-government funding piece can happen organically and at the community level. And the hope is that as communities start taking more ownership over this problem set, that these opportunities will become more, again, will materialize more easily. And it won't be top-down. It'll be sort of part of an existing relationship that companies have in that community that can be leveraged for this purpose. And I think the hope is that that is what can happen over time. But it's not going to be easy because there's still this the whole measurement and evaluation question, the whole how big of a threat is this actually compared to other threats in the community?
Yeah.
Maggie, I would also add a reiteration of a point I made earlier, which is that the Council of Mayors and the county executives represent an interest group within their own communities. Yes, they're government, but they represent it and they know their own communities. And if they feel some investment in this, even if it's targeted, as Eric said, and others, there is a tendency to go where the problem exists. The problem isn't just Islamist extremism. It's violence. It's public safety. And these converge at the local government level, and trying to figure out how to deal with them, particularly in an era of limited funds for government, means that there's an incentive on the part of those interest groups to build cohesive fundraising activities in local communities. And as they iterate it around among themselves, that may represent the best kind of gestation that we can have across the broadest spectrum.
On funding in particular, the language we use matters. And public safety, violence prevention, they are very relevant to this. Think of it as these big overlapping Venn diagrams when both sides have ownership over that overlapping space. I have a note from one of the briefings we did after the report came out where someone was saying to us, when it comes to funding from the private sector, the language is more peace and security. So that's not contradicting the language we're using here. We have to think about what terminology is going to most work.
I think peace and strength.
Peace and strength. In the industry, they tend to talk about peace and security. That's the language that they used when they came to us. let me just say this. If there are things in this report that you don't agree with, it's probably my doing. If there are things in this report that you agree with and that make sense and are brilliant, it's because of the people who participated in it. And I would hope you would join me in thanking them. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. Have a great weekend.
Thank you. Nice meeting you.
Oh, thank you.
I was watching out for you. She said, I want it back when she